Hi, I'm Mike Hudson, Director of the Museum of the American Printing House for the Blind. Welcome to the Redux presentation of sessions from the Hidden Legacies of Helen Keller Symposium, which was held in Louisville, Kentucky on September 17th and 18th, 2022. The symposium, with primary sponsorship from the American Printing House for the Blind and the Filson Historical Society, brought together scholars, writers, and Keller enthusiasts from across North America. In 2020, the American Foundation for the Blind Helen Keller Archive arrived at our museum on 23 pallets. And since then, our staff has been busy cataloging, describing, measuring, and inventorying this most amazing history of one of the most amazing women of the 19th and 20th centuries. I'm sitting in front of her desk from her house at Arcan Ridge. Helen Keller was a writer, activist, advocate, ambassador, and world traveler who profoundly affected the way the world thinks about people with disabilities. And yet, she is little understood, often frozen in time as a little girl with her hand under the water pump behind her parents' home in Tuscumbia, Alabama. Our symposium was just a beginning effort to bring together the most current scholarship in innovative ways to better understand Keller, her companion Anne Sullivan, and her times. We hope you enjoy the series. Each session will be dedicated to a single speaker from the symposium. Our second session on Saturday morning was titled Missing Pieces, Influence and Influencers, and focused on the circle of colleagues and friends around Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan. None of these tales are commonly included in biographies or legends about Keller, though the places, people, and events are known. Our second speaker in that session was writer Elizabeth Emerson. The great-great-granddaughter of journalist Joseph Edgar Chamberlain, Emerson used letters to reconstruct his Red Farm circle of friends and the safe harbor that Uncle Ed provided to Annie and Helen. Chamberlain and Keller's friendship lasted decades. He was one of her first political mentors, helping to develop Helen's awareness of national issues and her career's literary connections. Elizabeth Emerson is a former grant writer and award-winning artist based in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Her first book, Letters from Red Farm, The Untold Story of the Friendship Between Helen Keller and Journalist Joseph Edgar Chamberlain, was published in 2021 by the University of Massachusetts Press. She has also written guest articles for the American Foundation for the Blind's Helen Keller Archive newsletter and the Perkins School Archives.
Hello. I'm nervous. I'm not a public speaker. I'm a writer and an artist, among other things. But it's such a pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to speak with you about a friendship that Helen Keller held very dear. I'm here because my book, Letters from Red Farm, published in September 2021 by the University of Massachusetts Press, introduces a hidden figure in Helen Keller's life, my great-great-grandfather, Joseph Edgar Chamberlain. The story of their friendship was always there and is frequently touched on in other biographies, but I discovered there was so much more to it. And since it informed my own family history, my own personal history, I was especially motivated to uncover it. I'm going to use notes so that I can move really quickly. I know that some other speakers are wonderful speaking extemporaneously, but I'm not one of them. So I'll do a few readings from the book and hopefully give you a sense of the Letters from Red Farm story and how Ed Chamberlain and his Red Farm circle influenced Helen Keller and Annie Sullivan. To begin, in a nutshell, Letters from Red Farm tells the story of the 40-year friendship between Helen Keller and Joseph Edgar Chamberlain, who was called Ed by his friends and family. They met in 1888 in Boston when Helen was 8 years old, and Ed was almost 40 and a prominent journalist and writer in Boston and beyond. He was a columnist for the Boston Evening Transcript and was known as the listener of the Transcript. In 1888, Helen had just come to Boston from her home in Tuscumbia, Alabama, with her teacher, Annie Sullivan, to attend school at the Perkins School for the Blind. She was already an international celebrity, thanks to reports broadcast widely by the director of Perkins, Mr. Michael Anagnos, who used Helen as the poster child for the school's work with children who were blind and deafblind. Newspapers hounded Helen and Annie Sullivan. As a respite from the attention and from her schoolwork, Helen and Annie soon began spending weekends and holidays with the Chamberlain family at their home called Red Farm in the town of Wrentham, just outside of Boston. Eventually, they lived with the Chamberlains for a year when Helen was 16. So how did I come to discover this story? I'll read an excerpt from the preface to Letters from Red Farm because it says exactly what I want to say and what I want you to know. As it turns out, our family's best memory keeper was a deaf-blind girl named Helen Keller. I grew up fascinated by books about Helen. I was captivated by the story of the child who could neither see nor hear and whose inner potential and delightful personality were revealed by her teacher, Annie Sullivan. While millions around the world also read those stories, I had a unique and personal relationship to them. Books about Helen frequently mentioned times she spent with a family named Chamberlain at their home called Wrentham, or Red Farm in Wrentham. As I read, I knew that she had spent those happy hours with my great-great-grandparents, Joseph, Edgar, and Ida Chamberlain, and their children. Ed and Ida's fourth child and second daughter was Elizabeth, my great-grandmother. The fact that Helen spent parts of her childhood with my ancestors was the extent of my knowledge of the relationship until a few years ago, when I came across copies of 2 letters that had been passed down through 4 generations of my family. One was the letter of sympathy written by Helen in 1935 upon hearing that her Uncle Ed had passed away. The other was a letter written to Ed a few years earlier, or actually a year earlier, a long and intimate document that illustrated a lengthy history and close relationship of more than 40 years. It was clear that not only were they friends, but the bond between them was deep and lifelong. And like many friendships, theirs appeared to have weathered good times and tumultuous times. Now, I felt compelled to find out more. My research started in earnest in January 2012 when I called the American Foundation for the Blind in New York City at the time, where most of Helen Keller's personal letters and papers were archived. From an online search, I knew there existed a box of letters related to the Chamberlains in their collection. I reached Helen Selsden, the head archivist at the AFB, and I began by telling her that I was the great-great-granddaughter of Joseph Edgar Chamberlain, a man who had been a journalist in the Boston area and friends with Helen for many years, and I was interested in doing some research. I could hear the phone being jostled, repositioned. Say that again? I repeated my story, not sure if I had any business making this call. Oh my goodness, Miss Selsden said, the Chamberlains were huge in Helen's life. It's so amazing to hear from you. Are you really of the family? She was eager to help me. 5 days later, I received a 20-page list of hits in the Foundation database that involved the Chamberlains. It was immediately obvious from the entries that the narrative revealed would not be the one that I had expected. Somehow I had imagined that I would discover a pleasant, straightforward tale about my friendly family who invited Helen and Annie for dinners and holidays at their home. Instead, what I found was a complex and multi-layered story that told of joys and talents, but also controversy, tragedy, and personal and systemic failings. 6 months after that first call, I visited the AFB offices in New York City, and I should say that so much has been digitized since then, but that was back in the day when you actually had to handle the papers and peruse the boxes and files. So the Helen Keller Archive file room was filled floor to ceiling with neatly labeled boxes of letters and photographs, movie reels, and monographs. Miss Selsden had already identified key boxes where she thought I should begin my research. She loaded my arms, then her own, with folders and showed me to a cubicle. The hundreds of letters were organized by author and in chronological order. The earliest was a March 1892 letter from Ed to Annie asking if Helen was giving thought to an earlier request from him to write, quote, a little written account of her instruction, end quote, for the popular periodical he edited called The Youth's Companion. I was thrilled to see for the first time the small, flowing handwriting of my great-great-grandfather. It was clear that Helen and her teacher were already acquainted with him, for he wrote, "You know me, I do not want a long story." Those files provided the perfect starting point, but I would subsequently find countless other sources. The AFB documents led me to the Alexander Graham Bell family papers archived at the Library of Congress, which provided copies of many more letters and even more illuminating details. As a journalist for more than 60 years, Ed Chamberlain left a long and rich trail, of his own. A number of biographies of the avant-garde artists and writers who frequented Red Farm also mentioned the Chamberlain family and aspects of their life. The Perkins School archive was also invaluable. But the writer who gave the most consistent breadth and detail of life in the Chamberlain household was Helen. She was a prolific and generous letter writer and often described events at Red Farm. In Ed Chamberlain, a man she met when she was just 8 years old, who lived in the service of words and cared deeply about people and social issues in the natural world, Helen found a most sympathetic and understanding friend, mentor, and advocate. Letters from Red Farm is their story. So, what was Red Farm? And I have allergies, so I have to wipe my nose occasionally, so excuse me. So when I was getting close, when University of Massachusetts Press was, we were almost finished with all of the copy editing and everything. Well, actually, we weren't that far along, but my editor said, I need to know what Red Farm is right up front. So he had me move a whole bunch of text that was later in the book into the introduction. And so I'll share that with you at this point. At some point in time, the place became known as Red Farm. It was an idyllic spot, just a short train ride out from Boston. In the late 1800s, it was a working farm situated on 30 or so acres of open fields that straddled the crest of a hill and overlooked a small lake called King Philip's Pond. The property featured a large red-painted farmhouse with a wide front porch that commanded a view of the lake below. Multiple red barns and outbuildings dotted the property, and a tall windmill on scaffolding dominated the front yard. To the rear, a deep vine-covered ravine dropped away from the house and main barn. Several large trees close to the house provided shade in summer months. For those at Red Farm, it was little trouble to shift from farming pursuits to boating and swimming in summer, or ice skating and sledding in winter, simply by crossing the dirt lane in front of the house and strolling down the embankment to the lake. It was a perfect combination of waterfront resort and rural farm life. Red Farm cast a spell over its residents and guests. Over many years, it was the gathering place for a lively and diverse crowd of intellectuals and creative minds, drawn to the location and the hospitality of Boston journalist Joseph Edgar Chamberlain. Poets and writers, artists and musicians, naturalists, theologians, social reformers, and celebrities all flocked to Red Farm, captivated by its brilliant and stimulating atmosphere. Guests were invited to help with farm chores and meals if so inclined, before gathering in the evening for readings and performances by young and old alike, indoors in front of a large stone fireplace in cold weather or outside on the lawn in summer. Chamberlain himself presided over these assemblies, gently encouraging and mentoring aspiring writers or reading his own works. This was the atmosphere into which Helen and Annie were welcomed and embraced. Ed Chamberlain and Red Farm played a significant role in Helen's life. The Chamberlain home was a gateway to the literary and publishing world for Helen and Annie. It was at Red Farm that they met many prominent literary figures and also were exposed to a creative and literary life, one in which people experimented with writing and the arts and were free to be themselves. Red Farm was a community in which there was tolerance for a wide range of people, including diverse sexual identities, gender roles, and where they met interesting people, such as the Native American artists Angel Decorah and Zikalisha. It was while residing at Red Farm that Helen made the decision when she was 16 to stay in Boston with her teacher to pursue her own education and not return home to Alabama with her mother. She made her own choice in the safety of the Chamberlain home. Ed Chamberlain's discussions with her about war and his reporting on the Spanish-American War influenced Helen greatly and contributed to her own distaste for war. Helen and Ed adored each other. He was her dear Uncle Ed, and she was his dearest Helen. I knew as I conducted my research that this was a story Helen wanted told. In 1898, when she was 17, she wrote to a friend, "I wish you knew Mr. Chamberlain better. I think you would find much to admire in his character. He runs through life's maze of joys and woes so peacefully and with such kindliness towards all living things that one cannot be with him and not feel something of his gentle influence." She also wrote about his behind-the-scenes influence in her life in a lengthy article in American Magazine in 1912. Ed, in turn, wrote about Helen in a way few people could, advocating for her education, writing about what it was like to spend the day with her, her favorite pastimes, praising her published works, and many other related topics for nationally syndicated newspapers and magazines. In closing, I'll read just the beginning of the letter Helen wrote to Ed's widow, his third wife, in July 1935. She wrote on the day after Ed's passing. "Dear Aunt Jenny, I received with tender sorrow up here in the Catskills the telegram with the news of dear Uncle Ed's death. When I last saw him so brave and interested in everything, I could not think that he would leave us so soon. If I could take you and the others who loved him in my arms, you would feel the sympathy no words can utter. I realize that there can be no consolation for the loss of one whose life was a part of your own, but affection will speak, the affection my teacher and I have had for Uncle Ed during many years. We remember how he always understood and appreciated us both. The tears come as I think how bound up he is with the fateful experience of our lives." End of excerpt. So Letters from Red Farm illuminates Helen and Ed's connection and those fateful experiences that she talked about. And as much as I could in the writing of the story, I let Helen's and Ed's words tell it. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you today. Ed Chamberlain truly was a hidden figure in Helen's life, and I'm proud to reveal him for contemporary readers and scholars. Thank you so much.